There are 40 species of wildcat in the world. Most people know the big seven: the tiger, lion, jaguar, leopard, puma, cheetah, and the snow leopard, although the last one might be a little bit more unknown. But that aside, most people will struggle to name the remaining 33, which are the smaller cats. Here I will talk about one of those cats in Latin America that most people have never heard of, the jaguarundi. It's got many different names. The Germans, for example, call it the Wieselkatzen or weasel cat, due to its long body and short legs. In terms of its evolutionary place among the cats in Latin America, it is also an odd one out. All small cats in Latin America are part of the Leopardus branch, or genus. There are 8 Leopardus species, with ocelots and margays likely the best known. Many of these look fairly similar, with actually some interbreeding happening where more than one species occurs together, indicating their similarity. The jaguarundi is part of a very different group, related to the puma branch, which consists only of puma, cheetah and the jaguarundi, as the only small cat member of this group. The jaguarundi therefore has a genus of its own, and it's the only member. The genus is Herpailurus. The official scientific name of the jaguarundi is Herpailurus jaguauandi. The jaguarundi is different in other ways. It is active in the day, while other neotropical cats are active at night or dawn and dusk. You can actually see why this is when you look at the skull of the jaguarundi, which is very different from the other cats. The eye sockets are considerably smaller, compared to, for example, a house cat. The much more elongated and flat skull equally gives more merit to the German name of weasel cat. Jaguarundis are always plain colored, without markings, but there is a variation in color. The most common morph concerns a relatively dark coat with a reddish-brown tinge. However, there are color morphs that are bright red-brown, while others are almost black and some even describe a gray-silver colored one. The darker morphs are more common, while the reddish morph is considered the original jaguarundi color pattern. There does not seem to be a particular geographic distribution of these morphs, with about a quarter being lighter red-brown and the rest darker. The jaguarundi is found from Mexico to northern Argentina, covering a wide variety of habitats. It seems to be fairly well adapted to living close to people, and thus is vulnerable to road collisions, especially as they are active during high traffic hours in the day. Similar to the other Leopardus cats in Latin America, the jaguarundi preys on small rodents, birds and reptiles. Being found across a vast area across Central and South America, while possibly more easily seen because of its daytime activity patterns and proximity to people, the jaguarundi is considered least concerned on the IUCN Red List of Endangered Species. However, very little is known about the cat, and there are very few scientific studies on the species. We don't know what habitats they prefer within this continent-spanning range. Where do they seem to be found in higher numbers, and where do we predict jaguarundi strongholds are located? Although seen more frequently than other cats, it does not seem to be a prolific species by any measure, and thus we need to know more about the state of the species to assure the least concern and lack of care for it does not translate into disappearing without us knowing about it. To shed light on the state of jaguarundis across their range, we started a collaborative project involving 17 institutions across 13 range countries, collating camera trap data from across the jaguarundi range. A camera trap is a digital camera placed in the wild with a sensor detecting any living mammal walking in front of it. Now, having access to records from 4,000 different camera locations across the Latin American landscape, we could figure out what kind of location seems most suitable for jaguarundis. In other words, under what conditions did we have a high chance of detecting jaguarundi, and under what conditions did they seem absent? We could figure this out as we knew how long each camera was working and how many pictures of jaguarundis each camera took. With the enormous variety of conditions in which these 4,000 cameras were placed, differing in general weather conditions at the location, forest cover with tall trees, or shrub vegetation without a tree canopy, availability of water, ruggedness of the terrain, altitude, nearby human presence, and a lot of other variables. Now we could use computer models to crunch the numbers and assess what variables were positively or negatively associated with jaguarundi occupancy. We found that jaguarundi occupancy was significantly associated with increased ruggedness of terrain, shrub vegetation, rural agricultural environment, while negatively influenced by seasonal rain or high variation in seasonal temperatures. We now had a model showing under what conditions the chance of jaguarundi occupancy would be most likely. This allowed us to create a predictive map showing where such conditions were found across the Latin American continent. This map shows which areas are most likely occupied by jaguarundi, with green areas having a high amount of certainty of occupation and red areas having a low probability that they are occupied by the cat, with orange areas being intermediate. Looking at this map, there seem to be large swaths of unsuitable habitat, red areas within its total distribution extent. Jaguarundi seem to have a much lower probability of being found at the core of their distribution extent in the heart of the Amazon, while having a higher probability of being found in the middle of Central America and at the edges in the west and east of South America. Of course, we have to indicate that our model is just an initial model, and one obvious flaw concerns the predicted occupancy of jaguarundi in southern Argentina and Chile, where we have long-term confirmation that jaguarundis are truly absent, now indicated in blue. Even though our model might be suboptimal, it does allow us to make some very crude assessments of the likely area that jaguarundis still occupy. When we know the area of occupancy, we can even make a very quick and dirty rule of thumb estimate of the world population of jaguarundis. Assuming a somewhat arbitrary but not improbable average jaguarundi home range of 36 square kilometers, not an unreasonable range size for a small cat like the jaguarundi, and if we equally assume that this 36 kilometer squared patch is occupied by a male and a female, 2 individuals, we can make a rough guesstimate of the number of jaguarundis. If we only consider the most optimal conditions of the darker green in the map, between 1 and 0.8 chance of occupancy, jaguarundis would live across 650,000 square kilometers, which would fit only around 36,000 individuals. This seems very unlikely, and the numbers increase when we use a less conservative cutoff point between 1 and 0.65, going to the light green, covering over 2 million square kilometers, fitting around 113,000 individuals. If we assume occupancy between 1 and 0.5, we would assume coverage of around 4.5 million square kilometers, fitting around 250,000 individuals. Even our last estimate of 250,000 individuals means there are not necessarily that many jaguarundis in the world, especially if they are spread out with few hotspot areas with lots of jaguarundi. We therefore feel that the cautionary principle of concern is valid for this small and unknown cat. It seems to prefer shrub habitat in underdeveloped rural environments. If conservation concentrates on the important Amazon, and don't get us wrong, the Amazon is important, this species might be overlooked. Intensification of agriculture might create conditions that are far less suitable for this species, and it might be driven over the edge. We want to make sure that the jaguarundi is not overlooked. A small but special little cat.